Hi guys, welcome to the Headphone Show. Today we're going to take a look at the SPL Phonitor One D headphone amplifier and DAC combo. I've unceremoniously stolen this from Taryn's desk before he's had a chance to listen to it, so he's really upset with me, but that's okay. We're of course very familiar with the higher end line of SPL headphone amplifiers like the Phonitor X, which is something I often use for dynamic driver moving coil headphones. So we've been excited to check out this one here, which is, it comes in at a much more modest price at around $700. Now, without further ado, let's take it out of the box and check it out. This is empty. Where's the Phonitor One D? Wait, is it with that new reviewer?
Hi everyone, my name's Grover, and as you can see, I've got yet another new job and new hairstyle. I just want to say before I get started that I'm super excited to be joining the team over at headphones.com, and that I'm really looking forward to getting to know folks in the community and putting out more content. That said, let's jump into the Phonitor One D. So as some of you may know, the Phonitor XE has been a longtime reference of mine. The Phonitor series of amplifiers are really exceptional solid-state amplifiers in my mind. And they've been very popular in the community. They offer a sound which I would describe as very transparent, without any of the downsides we might typically associate with an amplifier that has high levels of detail retrieval, right? They're not super gritty or grainy in the high end. They don't have an excessive brightness or harshness. They don't accomplish their sense of transparency through, to my ears at least, being tipped up in the treble or exaggerated in any way. Now, one of the things that I think is special about that is that that's a very hard feat to pull off in a solid state amplifier across a variety of headphones, whether you have high impedance, low impedance, whether your headphones happen to like a lot of current and maybe are planar magnetic, or whether your headphones are more sensitive dynamic headphones, regardless of the impedance. I can plug in a pretty wide variety of headphones into the Phonitor XE. My headphone stable includes things like the ZMF Verite, Ether 2, Focal headphones, Audeze LCD-XC, LCD4, and a pretty wide variety of other headphones as well. This was a little bit of a difficult review for me because I had to, be very aware that this amp is a much lower cost than the Phonitor XE, right? This is, I think, $700 with the included DAC, and about $549 without the included DAC. So this is obviously a price point which is significantly lower than the full-size Phonitor amps. The question for me coming into this review was, how much of the Phonitor sound is SPL going to be able to bring down into this price point? From an ergonomic standpoint, everything on the Phonitor One is going to be pretty similar to what you'll see on the Phonitor X's. You got the volume knob, the kind of matte finished metal front plate, the Crossfeed knob, and then some switches for inputs. Now, the Crossfeed knob on this one is significantly simpler than on the larger Phonitor amps. It's not the full matrix. It's a much more simplified single knob solution. Pretty much you're just going to be dialing in how much of the Crossfeed you want that's set at a fixed angle. Now, if you do love the Phonitor Crossfeed and you want the whole enchilada, so to speak, then you should probably look into one of the higher end Phonitor models, not the Phonitor One D. However, this one does still have the Crossfeed function, so it is there if you like it. From a design and build standpoint, I always find the Phonitor amplifiers to have been excellent. They're not the blingiest thing you'll ever find. Pretty simple, but well built, and they feel good in the hand. They're not excessively heavy. I really like the matte front. It's just got a nice feel to it, and generally it feels sturdy and substantial. While it is merely a cosmetic feature, I do kind of miss the VU meters in the bigger Phonitor amps. They're just super cool. I'd also like to point out that the cord is extremely short on this amplifier. I was kind of shocked when I first pulled it out. You guys can see it's, like 2, maybe 3 feet. It's very short. I actually had a lot of difficulty finding a way to plug this into my existing system. I actually had to plug it into my hi-fi system first, then do some rearranging in my studio to get the amplifier to fit so that I could use the power supply. So not a fan of that. If you have a setup that requires a longer cable for whatever reason, this may not necessarily be your first choice. Please make it longer, SPL. One of the most significant changes between the Phonitor One D and the other SPL Phonitor amps is that this one is using a Burr Brown OPA 2134 op amp instead of SPL's 120 volt Voltaire op amp. So the topology is a bit different and the power rating is quite a bit lower. So the SPL Phonitor One D is going to give you about 400 milliwatts in the 47-50 ohm range The sound of this amplifier is generally in the same range of the SPL Phonitor amps. So if you've heard those amps and you know what that sound is, then you're going to be somewhat familiar with what you're getting in the Phonitor One D. Now, I will say that I don't notice quite the level of transparency with this headphone amp as I do with the larger Phonitor series amps. It's pretty resolving. I would put it, above something like, a shit Jotunheim or something like that, where you are starting to get into a realm where you'll hear a little bit deeper into a mix. You'll hear a little bit more details popping out in the treble than you would with a $200 to $400 more entry-level solid-state amplifier. What you also get is a real sense of smoothness and a real general absence of a lot of character, right? So you're not going to hear an amplifier which feels like it's imprinting a ton of its own personality on the signal, right? The character that's there reveals itself more in the transients and in the dynamic qualities of the amplifier than in any sort of direct perceptual frequency response range. It doesn't feel like the treble's tipped up. The bass doesn't feel tipped up. The mid-range seems relatively linear and neutral. If you listen to the treble, it's got that same smooth, coherent character that the SPL amps have, and generally even that the SPL Pro Gear has in my experience. It's a very pleasing effect, especially with headphones that have very smooth treble. Something like a Focal Stelia, for example, might make a great pairing with this amplifier because the treble being very, very smooth means that you can listen at relatively high volumes and to relatively bright mixes without feeling that there is any sort of harshness or excess energy in the treble. The SPL does maybe round off the transients just a little bit in the treble presentation to get that slightly softer sound. It's not lower in level. It's not, undynamic. It's not that there's a lack of clarity. It's just that there's a slight softness to the edge of note attacks, right? There's a slight smoothness there, which I think is actually quite a pleasing effect. And especially at this price point, I think is actually a good choice. One place where it departs from the higher end SPL amps is it doesn't have the level of refinement in the treble. So even though there's a slight smoothness and a slight coherency and maybe a slight rounding to things, the higher end SPL amps give you more of a sense of space. They give you more of a sense of dynamic attack coming from a quieter background, and they give you just a little bit more 3D depth in the higher end. I think in general, though, most people who are buying an amplifier at this price point will probably be pretty happy with the treble presentation. It's quite good, and I'm really nitpicking here when I say that there's small things that I think that it doesn't do well or small amounts of character. It's a generally very neutral treble presentation. Moving on down to the mid-range is where I start to have a few issues. It's a little bit darker. It feels like there's a slight coloration going on in the mid-range. Instruments sometimes are a little too far back or a little bit hollow or a little bit strange in the 500 hertz range, almost a hint of like a darkness. And I think that this is a coloration that I sometimes associate actually with tube amplifiers that don't have enough feedback. They tend to sound a little bit warm, and I can actually see some people enjoying this presentation. It's certainly a bit more forgiving than the larger SPL amps, and certainly a lot more forgiving than many solid-state amps. From my perspective, this is coming from using the Phonitor XE as a reference. I don't enjoy that character as much, but I do think at this price point that it's not a huge knock against the unit. Now, one thing I did notice about it that was a little bit different from some amplifiers at the price point was that it felt a little bit dynamically constrained. I don't think that this amplifier is going to give you the dynamic swings, the macro dynamic swings that you might want from an amplifier which costs upward of $500 or $600. I found it to sound excellent on the new LCD XC. I thought it sounded great on the Ether 2s and things like that. But when I pushed the volume on those headphones, I did find it a bit more dynamically constrained than some of the other amplifiers that I own in this price point. The shit Jotunheim, for example, had quite a bit more dynamic capability at the cost of being a bit grainier and a bit less resolving. Moving on down to the bass, I find the bass on this headphone amplifier actually very satisfying. There's not much to say about it because it's just good. It's relatively linear. It punches, not the hardest that I've ever heard, but it has a nice character, and the bass of each song and each track seems to kind of be organically shaped. It doesn't seem to have any artificial character. It's not overly tight. It's not loose. It just seems to kind of be about where it should be for each individual mix. And that to me is a transparency I often only hear with tube amplifiers. Usually I'm hearing bass that from solid state amplifiers sounds too tight, or sometimes is actually overly warm because there's an attempt to either under or over damp it. That means you get something which is not entirely linear and imposes a character on every song that you hear. whereas with the SPL, it feels relatively transparent. There's maybe a slight warmth or a slight roundedness to the transient tax and the dynamics again, like the treble and mid-range, but I think in general that the bass does a good job of sounding how it should, based on whatever mix and whatever headphones you're listening to. So overall, the Phonitor One D from an analog standpoint, I think is a strong contender in this price point. Is it the best one? I don't know about that, but I do think it's a strong contender as just an amplifier. Now, let's move on to the digital section. I believe that SPL calls this the DAC 768 in reference to the fact that it will do 768 kilohertz, DSD, DXD, all that good stuff. Now, I personally don't listen to those formats that much, so I don't really care about this, but if that's important to you, this is actually one of the few DACs that I know of at the price point which has those formats covered, and it's, as far as I can tell, almost identical to the stage in the larger Phonitor series. The only thing that it's lacking is the DLP-120 dual roll-off filters. If digital is something that's really important to you, I can tell you that the DAC in the Phonitor XE and the DAC in the Phonitor 1D are not really things that I would consider super special. I think that to my ears, they sound like really, really good AKM 4490 presentations. Now, what I mean by that, if you're not familiar with the AKM 4490, is that it does have a slight warmth and a slight roundedness to the sound. This is really pleasing if you listen to a lot of really harsh digital recordings because it makes things sound a little bit smooth over. It costs you a bit of detail, however, compared to something like an ESS Saber chip. Now, I think the differences between them have been exaggerated, but I do find in general that the characterizations of an AKM sound or an ESS sound do somewhat hold up. This is not the newest DAC technology, the most exciting DAC technology though. The SPL implementation of this does seem like it's pretty good. It's a bit more detailed than something like a Modi 3 or something like other AKM 4490 DACs that I've heard in the $200 to $300 price point. There's a sense of refinement, there's a sense of ease and naturalness, and there is actually a fairly good sense of detail that you get with the DAC. Am I convinced that it's going to replace an outboard DAC? No. However, if your use case is taking this unit on the go, then I think that the DAC inside of it is actually fairly compelling. It's not going to give you the detail that a Saber 9038 is going to give you, but it's pretty good for what it is. Now, I'm not convinced that the Phonitor One D is an awesome choice at under $1,000, but I do think that the Phonitor One D analog section is an interesting choice in the $500 to $600 range. So my suggestion, if you really want that SPL sound, but you can't afford the higher end Phonitor XE amps, or if you want to take an all-in-one unit, say you're a mix engineer or a music producer or something like that, and you want a headphone amp, which is going to work with relatively more sensitive headphones in almost any environment you can think of and have good connectivity, it actually has TRS line in and outs on the back, then this might be a really good choice for you. And I think if you're after, again, that SPL sound, that smooth, very linear, very accurate, but not offensively bright sound, then the Phonitor 1D is going to be a great choice. One other disappointment for me in this amplifier was the Crossfeed section. I actually really like the Crossfeed on the Phonitor amplifiers, the larger Phonitor amplifiers, and I enjoy setting it at very low settings with very wide angles so that the filtering is very gentle. What I noticed with the Phonitor 1D is that whenever I turn the Crossfeed setting up to about more than a third, it starts to eat bass. And it feels as if I'm losing high end and top end in a way that's not particularly transparent. I don't really crank it more than halfway. In fact, halfway is probably way further than I would typically ever go with the knob on the Phonitor 1D. So for me, the Crossfeed is not quite as good in this unit as it is in the other Phonitor units because it doesn't have as much adjustability. They've set it to a fixed 30-degree angle, and I just don't particularly care for the sound of it. Now that said, that's just me. I feel like other people might enjoy the sound of it. It seems to take the soundstage and narrow it and sharpen things if you add just a little bit of it, and it can be a pleasant effect. Whereas on my reference Phonitor XE, I tend to leave the Crossfeed setting on all the time. I found myself generally not using it on the Phonitor 1D. My answer to the question of should you buy it? Well, I would say that, again, if you want that SPL sound, then this is probably a good choice for you. But if you're looking for something in the $500 to $600 price point, which offers a lot of power and is going to give you a little bit more of a exaggerated sound in some way, or you're looking to tune a pair of headphones which maybe has a response that you don't love, or has a response that's close, but you don't want to use EQ to get a certain sound flavor or character, then I don't know that the SPL would necessarily be my first choice. It doesn't have a lot of character. It's not going to make an HD 800 sound warm. It's not going to make an HD 650 sound bright. So that to me is kind of the soul of what makes a lot of pro audio products. There's a relative degree of transparency. Now, if you like that SPL sound though, and you've really bought into the brand, I think this is an interesting choice. I also think it has a lot more depth in terms of soundstage presentation than other choices at this price point. Something like a THX AAA amplifier, or even the outputs on an RME or a topping or SMSL unit are not going to have, to my ears, as much depth as the SPL Phonitor amplifier, even this inexpensive Phonitor One. I would personally, again, go for just the amplifier version, the Phonitor One, and leave out the DAC version unless you're planning on using this as a unit on the go. Thanks for joining me for this review of the Phonitor One D. As I mentioned, I'm super excited to be joining the Headphones.com community. Really looking forward to doing more videos, to getting to know some of you all, and to producing awesome content and listening to great headphones. Let me know if you guys have thoughts, reactions, comments, etc. I'll be on the Headphones.com forums much more actively going forward, and I would love to hear from you there as well.